Welcome to a story not written in ink, but in heartbeat and hesitation, a royal confession veiled in poetry and pain. She wasn't a chapter, she was the whole book he couldn't publish, the hidden tale of Sheikh Hamdan's unspoken truth, unfolds not with grandeur but with grace. This is not a love story told aloud in palaces, it's one that lived quietly between folded pages of restraint, where a prince became a poet and love became his forbidden scripture. There are stories the world gets to read, and then there are those guarded behind smiles too perfect to question. His life, adorned in light and leadership, was one such narrative, every page polished, every word measured. Yet, beneath those gilded lines lay an unwritten story, one that could never meet the public eye. She was that story. She was the book he could never print, the truth that refused to fit inside royal decorum. She arrived in his life like a sentence that didn't belong to the language of the world he lived in. Unscripted, unplanned, unstoppable. Her presence turned ordinary moments into verses, and her absence turned nights into chapters of longing. He tried to write her out of his destiny, but every time he picked up a pen, it was her soul that guided the ink. She was not a fleeting muse, she was his entire library of emotions bound in human form. Every poem he shared with the world was merely an echo of her essence. People praised his words, never realizing they were fragments of a story incomplete. The lines he published were the ones that didn't bleed too much, the safe ones. The real verses, the ones carved from his ribs, were tucked away in drawers no one dared to open. They were his confessions, the kind that love demands and royalty forbids. In the grand rhythm of his public life, she became his quiet rebellion. When he was expected to be royal, he was simply human with her. She saw the man behind the title, the soul beneath the crown. He didn't have to be Sheikh Hamdan in her presence, he could just be Hamdan, a heart searching for meaning beyond duty. And that was precisely why he could never let the world know, because love that real would rewrite the rules of royalty. There were moments he almost confessed through poetry. Subtle hints, hidden initials, metaphors too deliberate to be coincidence. Those who read deeply might have sensed her shadow, the way he described a silence more divine than speech or eyes that taught oceans how to listen. But only she would have understood the truth behind those metaphors. Only she could decode the language of his longing. He had once written, "Some loves are too sacred for paper." That line, simple yet eternal, was his reality. To publish her would be to expose his soul, and some parts of the soul are not meant for applause. She was his sanctuary, the secret heartbeat beneath his royal composure. And so, he chose silence, not out of fear, but out of reverence. For he knew the world would misunderstand a love that pure. The world saw a ruler whose verses glowed with wisdom, but few realized they were born of ache. Behind every eloquent word was a man wrestling between duty and desire, between what he owed the world and what he owed himself. He often wondered if destiny was cruel or careful, cruel for separating them, or careful for preserving what was too divine to be destroyed by time. Sometimes he would visit the desert alone, where no cameras or courtiers followed. There, he'd let the wind carry her name across the dunes. The silence of the sand didn't judge him, it simply listened. The horizon knew the truth, that even kings crave the simplicity of being loved, not for their crown, but for their chaos. And in that vast emptiness, he felt her most vividly, as if the universe itself remembered the story he could never share. The years may have distanced them, but love doesn't obey calendars. It lingers, like perfume on an unworn robe, like ink that refuses to dry. He built an empire, yet part of him always lived in that unwritten book, a realm only she could enter. She was the missing ending, the unfinished sentence that haunted every page of his life. He once said in an interview, "Not every truth needs to be spoken to exist." Those who knew his poetry knew that was not a statement, it was a confession. She existed in every silence between his words, in every pause where his voice trembled. He didn't need to name her for her
There were nights when he would stand at the edge of his balcony, the city lights glimmering below like scattered constellations of destiny. From afar, the world looked perfect, a kingdom at peace, a prince fulfilled. But within him, pages kept turning restlessly, searching for the sentence that never found its conclusion. He often imagined her somewhere under the same stars, reading the sky as if it were their shared diary. The distance between them was not measured in miles, but in the unsaid, in all the words he wanted to write yet couldn't. The silence became their eternal conversation, and in that quiet exchange, they loved more deeply than words could ever allow. He had written thousands of poems, but the ones that carried her name were never meant for eyes to see. They were love letters disguised as prayers, verses hidden behind metaphors and sand. In those sacred lines, he confessed not only his love but his surrender, for she was the only force stronger than his will. He wrote of her as the storm that taught him calm, the ache that taught him strength, the silence that taught him truth. And though he never published those words, they became his real legacy, not in the world's libraries, but in the chambers of his soul. At times, he would walk through the royal gardens late at night, the soft hum of the fountains echoing through his solitude. Each flower reminded him of something she once said, how beauty should never apologize for being delicate. He could still feel her presence in the breeze, in the rhythm of the palm trees swaying to unseen music. It was strange how love, though invisible, could still take up so much space in one's life. She had become the garden within him, ever blooming, even in absence. People often admired his discipline, his poise, his unwavering composure. Yet none knew that it came from heartbreak mastered into art. The world saw balance, he felt the weight. To rule a nation and yet be ruled by memory, that was his hidden paradox. There were times he wanted to tear the pages of destiny apart, to rewrite them in ink and defiance. But he didn't. Instead, he turned that defiance into poetry, transforming grief into grace. It was his way of loving her without betraying his world, and loving his world without betraying her. Sometimes, when dawn crept into his room, he would find himself speaking to her as if she were still there. Not aloud, but in thought. He'd whisper to the morning, "If the world knew what you mean to me, they'd understand every poem I've ever written." The rising sun